Sackney even gave me a name. While the little people had called me many things before, this was the first one I truly took to heart. And in those years, my heart grew nearly as fast as I did. When she died, I was once again heartbroken. It was a tragic accident, nearly 140 feet now. I was so massive it was hard to even move through the woods anymore without trampling everything in my path. I tended to just remain in one spot near the top of the waterfall as a result, and spent most of my time asleep or staring out over the vast and beautiful jungle, framed by the mountains hundreds of miles below. I don't know why she had come so close to me while I was sleeping that night, or what cruelty of fate caused me to roll over, but when I woke, I found I had accidentally crushed her to death. I could barely even recognize her. I had seen the little people cry before, but that was the first time I myself had ever truly wept. I hadn't even realized I was capable of it. I retreated deep into the forest after that, avoiding everything. Everyone was so small, and I was so dangerously large. I just wanted to go hide in a cave somewhere and never come out, but even finding such a large cave now would seem nearly impossible. As was so often the case in my life, I did not know how much time passed. Probably ages, but eventually the little people found me again, as they always did. But this time it was different. They remembered my name. They brought me food and gifts. They once again asked for my knowledge and my help to save and improve their lives. I enjoyed their company despite my distrust, apathy, and depression, even though they asked me to come with them to their town, and after much deliberation, I finally agreed. What I found when I arrived there was a landscape drastically transformed. The massive destruction of a forest replaced by farmland, and a great city made of stacked stone, much like the one I had made so long ago, but much more refined and massive. And the number of little people was uncountable. The forest devastation was so great that I could not even see the trees on the other side of the city. I just stood there towering over everything and felt horror ripple through me from my head to my toes. I felt as though this was somehow all my fault. I should have known this would happen. I should never have helped the little people, for they were so smart that the forest itself had become their prey. Or maybe I should have helped them more, taught them better to be stewards of the forest, not destroyers of it. I immediately left without a word back the way I came. They followed me, yelling and crying my name for some while before eventually giving up and returning to their desolation of a home. I went further south, far further south. I dreamed about that bird from so long ago. Was it the last of its kind? What destruction had I myself wrought on it or its species when I ate its eggs? I wasn't intelligent enough to have such thoughts back then when I did it, but now it was always there in the back of my mind. How easy it truly is to destroy something beautiful out of sheer ignorance. I finally found a new cave, my cave, large enough for me to fit in snugly, and I went to sleep. As always, I do not know for how long, ages most likely, and once again I was awoken by the little people. They hadn't changed much by my perception, but their noises were new. It took me some time to understand them again, but once I did, they told me of how things were. An empire, they said, greater than any before, and cities of stone which fed and housed vast numbers of little people. I could only barely imagine how many of them could survive on the fruits of the forest, but they told me they no longer needed the forest. They claimed to have tamed the wilds. I remember at one point asking one of their supposed wise men what had happened to the little people who I had once seen doing the same thing. He told me that their cities had been abandoned long ago, and that they retreated back into the forest. This gave me some hope, and I believed that in time, they too would return to the forest. I did not tell him my thoughts, though. I simply sent him away. More and more of them flooded to me, and before I knew it, they were erecting monuments all around my cave, destroying trees and slaying animals in the process. I tried to chase them off, but they would always return eventually. I fled them in a fit of anger one night. After years of fitful and interrupted slumber, I went further south. Eventually, I found another home, one of many in my travels, but it was suitable. Deep, dark, and hidden in the bowels of a sinkhole. Nobody but I could get down this deep into the earth. So here I would finally be safe to rest. No more little people. No more sadness. But this time, it was a different kind of noise. Grating, whirring, ripping noises, alien noises, and the smell of fire and ash. I don't know how long had passed, but when I woke, deep in my hidden chamber, I knew something had changed. These were not noises of the forest or even noises of the little people. I had to investigate. When I peeked out of my cave, I stood up and looked over the trees to see smoke filling the air and huge swaths of forest completely burned to the ground. I went to see what was happening and observed the little people burning and chopping and tearing at the trees with strange tools I'd never seen before. Noisy tools, violent tools. Some of them spotted me, and it wasn't long before they were screaming and fleeing in mass. I couldn't understand. There were no crops here, no city. Why were they destroying the forest, burning it to the ground even, not even using the wood from the trees as they used to? I walked through the devastation and saw it stretched out seemingly forever. In the distance, I saw strange buildings, very different from the stone and thatch ones I was familiar with. The vast herds of unusual animals I had never encountered before. The forests had turned to grassland at the hands of the little people. I stood and watched over the area for a few years, frightening off those who dared trespass. I wandered around and patrolled, destroying the infrastructure the little people used to attack the forests wherever I found it. I took care never to hurt any of them, and it wasn't hard as they always fled in my presence. I became cold-hearted though, and felt the little people were a plague, a disease I had allowed to fester. Once again, I believed this was my fault, that it was something I could have prevented. Time continued to pass. Many suns, many seasons, many years. I remember one day I saw a strange bird fly overhead. I now know that it was an aeroplane, but at the time it reminded me of the bird from when I was just a young cripple. Giant, majestic, beautiful. I tried to follow it, but it was far too fast, and I watched it disappear over the mountains. Remembering what new lands the bird would discover over there. Maybe ones without little people. No matter how much I tried, though, I couldn't stop the destruction. Always small groups, simple tools, and a lot of fire. I could not be everywhere at once. I felt despair. Time passed, but an old man found me one day and spoke to me in new and unusual noises. At first, I ignored him, but he persisted and slept nearby every night, refusing to leave. He would come every day and make the same noises at me. He seemed harmless, and I felt lonely. So, on a whim, I decided to let him stay for a while so that he might teach me the new noises. We were eventually able to speak more clearly. He gave me his name, Fabio, and he was also born in the forest. He told me many strange, wonderful, and terrible things. He told me about how the land was now used for raising cattle. He told me about how the silver bird was in fact a machine created by little people. He told me what he knew about science, about history, about society, that there were entire nations of little people all over the world, that the little people had conquered it all. I came to feel he was like me, for he seemed saddened by it. He said there was nobody left who understood the old ways, living in the garden and only taking what you require. He told me few people believed in it anymore. The eye was just a scary story told to frighten frontiersmen's children, or just a mythology told in schools. That those who claimed to have seen me were met with disbelief, and he said that he had seen me as a child when I had run off his parents at the edge of the forest, and that he had spent his whole life searching for me since then. The little people were always full of surprises. I took him in, and his welcome company and knowledge warmed me as I continued to hide in the cave. He taught me to play chess. He told me wonderful stories, even brought me books. I had seen the scratchings in stone from long ago and their meanings, but these were far more sophisticated. I learned to read, and I lusted after knowledge. He would go out once every few months and bring back more books, photographs, and at one point even a motion picture for me, which I devoured greedily. Years passed almost in an instant, and I barely ever left the cave. Eventually, he told me I would need to face my fears and do something about the encroaching little people who grew closer every day. But I knew he could see my wounded spirit, and he was kind and let me rest, never pressing me. He knew the little people had broken my heart, but what is broken can break again, and when he finally passed away a few years later, I found myself alone once more, timeless, not like the trees, but like the very stone I dwelled in. I knew everything around me was ephemeral. It was all going to change and die anyways, so what did it matter what I did? And so I slept. I don't know how long, it might have been ages. Eventually, I was awoken again by the little people's noises. Well, in this case, you specifically, of course. I remember thinking at the time that I was half tempted to snatch you all up and carry you to the edge of the forest and tell you to never return, but I observed you from a distance without intervening to see what you did. My trust of the little people was low enough by now that I was prepared to even squash you if you stepped afoul, but to my surprise, you were all nothing if not respectful of your surroundings. After several weeks of observing you, I saw you rescue animals, study the plants, record information. I saw you exploring and appreciating the wonder of the forest, just like the little people of old, just like I did. I realized you were the scientists the old men had told me about, that you were here to learn, not destroy. And that was when I decided to make myself known. I knew you would be terrified, but I was used to it at this point, and I still remember the look on your faces when I first presented. But when I managed to convince you I was harmless, your innate scientific curiosity took over, I can only assume. The same curiosity which drives me. I believe you are like the other little people I once knew, kind, loving, and well-intentioned. And that is why I trust you with my story. I hope you are able to share it and help me. For while I was once called a god, I am just as helpless as a baby snake crawling, crippled in the mud on the forest floor. I turned off the recorder at that point and looked up at the towering, feathered serpent, unfathomably large. I told him that was the last thing I needed and that I would return to see him again as soon as I could. He nodded in understanding, but watched with a sorrow in his eyes as we slowly made our way into the woods, leaving the cave we had been exploring for weeks behind. My colleagues and I had expected to discover an immense undiscovered network with possibly uncatalogued species. We had not expected to discover this particular uncatalogued species. As I transfer this log of his recording, we are setting up camp less than a day from the airstrip where we will be picked up. I don't know if anyone will believe me or if they will think I photoshopped our pictures, but the rest of the team agrees we need to tread lightly, lest we bring him unwanted attention. But I have to do something. I still remember the first words he spoke to me, after all those days of terror and uncertainty, not knowing if we had discovered a monster, not knowing if we were going to die, but the monster turned out to be anything but. I will never forget what he said the first time he spoke to us. I have been watching you. Do not fear. I have been here a long time. The world is changing and I am crawling in the mud again. I was once a little forest snake, but I was given the name Quetzalcoatl long ago by someone I loved very much. Now, once again, I am as helpless as a little snake. I need you. Every day my home gets smaller and the little people grow. Every year I must hide deeper to avoid their shiny birds and stinging smoke. I may look big to you, but I am just a simple creature crawling in the mud. Please, help me save my home. I'm writing this from my bed. It's almost dawn. I can feel that I don't have much time left. I can barely see anymore. I hope this account serves as a warning to everyone about what's up there in the mountains at the Pine Palaces. Please, just stay away from it. God, my eyes itch. There are some things we weren't meant to find. Please, someone, hear this so we're not forgotten. This is what happened. I arrived at the Pine Palaces 3 days ago. It was as beautiful as the website boasted, high up in the West Virginia mountains, where the air was untouched by cities and smog, and where you could feel the purity in every breath. The cabins I would be maintaining, along with the other 2 summer workers, weren't quite palaces, but they were elegant in a natural sort of way. Each log cabin was decked out in all the unusual outdoor decor. Animal heads hung silently on the walls, polished exposed wood filled the interiors with a delightful smell, and a fireplace sat ready to burn the neatly stacked pile of wood that rested beside it. There were 8 cabins in total, 6 for guests, and 1 for the owner of the retreat, Ken, who lived there year-round. They formed a semicircle along the perimeter of tall trees, where space had been made for a giant fire pit in the center. Half a mile down the dirt road, there was a lake that Ken rented out paddle boats for the guests to use. I had asked him upon arrival if employees could use them free of charge, and he had winked and told me if he likes his workers. Behind the cabins, down a path that led into the woods about 400 feet from the clearing, was where our maintenance supplies were kept. Rakes, leaf blowers, a couple of axes, a chainsaw, the usual upkeep wares. I remember on the first day when Ken showed us the old shed, one of my fellow workers, Carter, had asked why he kept the supplies so far back. Ken had chuckled and told us that we'd understand once we got married and went on vacation with our families. He slung his arm around my shoulder and said he had never seen people fight worse than up here where most modern amenities were unavailable.
Wouldn't put it past one of them to take the chainsaw to their significant other,
he had said, throwing Penny a wink. Penny, the last piece to our trinity of workers, looked at Carter and then at me, her face unsure and a little nervous.
Oh, don't you worry,
Ken had said.
I've never really had trouble up here. Not real trouble, anyway. Most folks are good, honest people, just looking to get away from all the nonsense. They come up here to roast their marshmallows, eat their dogs, and listen to the sweet sound of that peaceful silence.
After that, we all went back to the cabins, and Ken began instructing us on our daily duties for the summer, and we prepared the site for the arrival of our first wave of visitors the next day. 3 days later, I found that I enjoyed being up in the mountains more than I had anticipated. The quiet days, the chirps, squeaks, the groans of nature, the warm yellow sun, and the explosion of bright crystal stars that light the night. Carter, Penny, and myself all got along very well. In fact, it felt weird that we had only known each other for 3 days. We were all outgoing, inspired, and we all wanted something a little different to fill our time between semesters. We wanted to go back to college in the fall and have unique experiences and adventures to tell our friends. And then there was Ken. Ken had been running this place for 28 years. His dad built it, and when he passed away, Ken took over. He was proud of it. You could tell by the way he worked, the way he moved, and the way he talked to the guests. He was about 60, but had the mentality of a man in his young 20s. He was energetic, kind, and made everyone feel welcome. He insisted all the visitors call him Grandpa Ken, and if anyone wanted, at sundown he'd tell stories about the history of the mountains and lands around us. It was charming, and I found myself looking forward to that time of the day. That was all before I found that well. I pulled the paddle boat behind Ken's cabin and wiped the sweat off my face with the dirty hand. "That's the last of them," I said to Carter. "Everyone is in for the day. Penny should be done stacking the wood for tonight's fire. Do you want to see if she wants to go for a swim?" Carter, tall and thin, sporting glasses and blonde hair that he was always pushing away from his lenses, nodded.
"Yeah, that sounds good. Oh, I feel like I'm gonna melt. It's hot as hay fever today, isn't it?"
I snorted. "Got that right. You can go check out with Ken. Let him know that we're finished for the day. Make sure he doesn't need anything. I'll go help Penny put the tools away." I brushed my hands on my jeans and walked around the front of the cabin. A couple of guests were sitting on their porches, enjoying the shade and starting to wind down for the evening. I spotted Penny by the fire pit, stacking the last few pieces of wood. "All done?" I asked. She looked up at me.
"Yeah, that should do it. I hope that's enough."
Penny was a cute girl, nothing to write home about, but her charm came not from her looks, but from the adorable way she always worried she was going to get in trouble. I smiled back. "It's fine. You really think Ken has the capacity to yell at you even if it's not?" She shrugged.
I just want it to be right.
"It is. Now, do you want to go swimming with Carter and I? He's letting Ken know right now." She lit up.
Oh, that sounds fantastic. Can you put the axe back in the shed while I go suit up?
"Sure thing," I said, bending and picking it up.
Thanks. I'll meet you back here.
She said and scampered off to our cabin to change. I slung the axe over my shoulder and made my way to the path that led into the woods, nodding my hellos to the guests I passed. The woods were quiet today, a low hum of wildlife getting lost in the gentle sway of trees that danced back and forth in the sunlight. My boots kicked up dry dirt as I walked, and I wondered when it had last rained. As I was about to round the final bend to the shed, something caught my eye. About 30 or 40 steps to my left, off the path, I spotted something coming out of the ground. Curiosity took over, and I began to make my way towards it. I wondered why I hadn't noticed it in my previous trips back here, but I had been more concerned on sticking to the path and not getting myself lost. As I walked closer, I saw that it was a well, its stone sides rising up out of the ground in the center of a big clearing. I broke through the tree line and stopped dead in my tracks. A heaviness came over me. A thick unease bubbled in my stomach. Something was making my skin crawl, and I felt goosebumps form on my arms. I licked my suddenly dry lips and swallowed hard. A warning light was going off in my mind, and my unease turned to panic nausea. Suddenly, I didn't even want to look at the well. I turned my eyes away and stood there, unable to move. I tried to tell myself to snap out of it, but the unbearable avalanche of horror that filled me when I tried to look at the well wouldn't allow it. I needed to leave. I felt my hands shaking at my sides, and I realized that I had dropped the axe. I couldn't even will myself to pick it up. "Why are you being such a baby?" I asked myself, still not moving. As soon as the thought crossed my mind, I knew the answer. Because something was down there. I ran. The terror turned to a feeling of haunting danger, and I fled. I crashed back down the path and back to the cabins, my disruption causing a few of the visitors to look my way curiously. I looked at them and offered a weak smile. Shaking my head and feeling slightly stupid now, I went to find Penny and Carter. The terror was fading quickly now that I was back around people, and I was starting to feel ridiculous about the whole incident. My breath steadied and my heart rate slowed. I shook my head, rolling my eyes. "Get a grip, man." I found Carter and Penny, and we all strolled down to the lake and went swimming, the cool water washing the dirt and sweat off us. I decided not to say anything to either of them about the well, but made a mental note to ask Ken what the deal was after his nighttime stories.
Sleep tight, folks, and thank you kindly for listening,
Ken said as the guests offered him a genuine round of applause. We were all sitting around a roaring fire, and Ken was just finishing telling us about how this place was built. For such a mundane story, Ken had filled it with practiced flair and charm that only old men seemed to be gifted with when telling a tale. As the visitors thanked Ken and lifted sleeping children over their shoulders to bed, I approached Ken. "Hey, can I ask you something real quick?" Ken, still sitting at his bench in the front of the fire, patted the space next to him.
Well, sure thing, kiddo. Have a seat.
He pulled out a cigar and cut the tip off, striking a match against the wood bench. I took my place, watching as the last of the guests retreated to their cabins for the evening. Carter and Penny looked at us inquisitively and came over, curious as to what I was going to ask. I took a deep breath. "What's the deal with the well back by the supply shed?" Ken froze, his match hovering inches from the tip of his unlit cigar. After a second, he lit it and took a couple deep puffs from it before answering.
What do you mean, son?
Carter and Penny had taken a seat on the bench next to us, and Carter piped up.
What well? There's a well back there?
"Yeah, it's in a clearing a little off the path," I said, pointing in the direction it was in. Ken turned his head and looked directly at me.
Don't go near there. Do you understand me?
The seriousness in his voice shook me. His grandpa persona was gone, and his eyes were cold black rock.
I mean it, son. Ain't nothing good back there. So just steer clear of it.
What's wrong with it?
Penny asked. Ken took another drag, obviously uncomfortable with the conversation, before answering.
It's dangerous. There's something wrong with it. I don't know what it is, but I know for a fact that, well, people ain't supposed to be around it. There's something unnatural about it. Best you all just keep your distance.
Carter leaned forward, his eyes lighting up.
Oh, is it haunted or something?
I could hear the excitement in his voice. Ken shook his head.
No, I didn't say that. Ain't no such thing as ghosts, kid, if you ask me. But there's other forces of nature that humankind just ain't meant to find.
I swallowed hard, remembering the terror from earlier. "Ken, is something down there?" Ken was silent for a moment, the crack of the fire popping sparks around us. Then he whispered.
Yes.
What is it?
Carter pressed.
Have you ever looked down there?
Ken shook his head.
Truth be told, can't bring myself to go near it.
Suddenly his head whipped around and he was looking hard at me again.
You didn't look down it, did you?
I shook my head. "No, honestly, I got spooked just being around it. That's why I asked. It seemed so jarring compared to the peace these mountains hold." Ken let out a sigh, but Carter wasn't done asking questions.
How do you know something's down there, then?
Ken tapped his cigar and a hearty piece of ash floated to the ground.
I had a horse back when I first took over the camp.
He started, then looked at Penny and cleared his throat.
Look, I don't want to go scaring Penny. Just take my word on this and stay away. Ain't no good can come of that place.
I want to hear.
Penny said. I didn't blame her. Something about the sober tone in Ken's voice begged for explanation.
Well, I suppose you're adults,
Ken said, staring into the fire.
But let me warn you, what I'm about to tell you is rather unsettling.
With a giant sigh, he continued, summoning the old memories.
Back when I took over this place, I had a horse. I named her Cherry. Beautiful creature. For the first couple of weeks, it was just Cherry and me. I was working hard on fixing the place up and getting it ready for the first guests again. During the peaceful evenings, I would ride Cherry all through these mountains.
He said, sweeping his hand across the dark horizon.
I would ride Cherry all through these mountains. And let me tell you, you haven't seen a sunset till you've seen one appear when the leaves start changing. It's magnificent. It's a calming way to end a long day. Yeah, anyway, one evening I tied Cherry up to that tree over there.
He said, pointing towards the path that led back into the woods.
We were about to go for our evening trot. I went inside to wash my face and change out of my trousers. Wasn't gone 5 minutes, but when I came out, Cherry was gone. I couldn't see her anywhere, but I could hear her.
He said, his voice quieting and shaking slightly.
And she was screaming.
Screaming?
Penny asked softly, eyes wide.
I never heard anything like that before, but I took off down the path in the direction of the screams, and that's where I found the well for the first time.
He paused, silently puffing on his cigar. After a few moments, he continued.
Cherry was trying to force her way down into the well. She was too big, though, and she was stuck, her rump sticking up in the air and her head down in the hole. She was going mad. Her hind legs were kicking and scraping against the stone walls of the well, trying her hardest to push the rest of her body inside. She was thrashing and wildly wiggling around, all the while screaming down into that hole.
His voice started shaking again.
But there was nothing I could do for her. I was too afraid. Something was keeping me from getting too close to that well. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rising, standing at stiff attention. Pretty sure I wet my trousers at some point as I stood there watching. Boy, I was frightened.
He said softly.
What happened then?
Carter said quietly. Ken looked around at all three of us, then said,
She eventually squeezed herself down into that blackness. Took her the better part of an hour to get the job done. She twisted and kicked until she scraped off her skin and fit. Ain't seen so much blood in my life. How she was still alive, I don't know. But I stood there and watched, paralyzed, as she grated herself against the stone until, eventually, she slipped down inside and her screaming immediately stopped.
We were all quiet as he finished. Ken idly flicked more ash from his cigar and stared at the ground. The unbelievable events he had just shared with us chilled me. I remember the feeling of being close to the well. I shivered.
Well, it's getting pretty late. I think I'm gonna call it a night.
Ken eventually said, standing and tossing his cigar into the fire.
You kids should get some sleep. It's gonna be a hot one tomorrow. I think a lot of the guests are gonna want to use those paddleboards. Night-night, folks.
We all stood up and wished him a good night, all of us somber and a little rattled, except for Carter. His eyes buzzed with light. We retired to our cabin and began preparing our bed. Penny slept in her own room after brushing her teeth and washing her hair. She bid us good night. Before she closed the door, I asked, "You okay, Pen? You're not freaked out?" She gave me an uneasy smile.
I'm not sure if I believe everything he said, but it was a pretty creepy story nonetheless. I'll be okay. Thanks, though.
And with that, she shut her door. I went to the room Carter and I shared, stripped down to my boxers, and laid on my bed. Carter followed and turned the lights off. We were silent for a while when I heard him sit up.
Dude, let's go check it out.
I sat up as well, slightly alarmed. What? No way, man. You heard Ken. We should stay away from it.
Oh, come on.
He pleaded.
It'll be spooky. Do you know how great it'll be to tell Penny in the morning that we went and looked down the well?
I snorted. Carter, you didn't see it. You weren't there. It creeped me out. No way I'm going back at night. Now, just lay down and go to sleep. Please, just drop it. After a moment, I heard him sigh and lay back down. Relieved, I closed my eyes and stared at the ceiling. Sleep did not come quickly. I don't know what time it was when my eyes snapped open, but something was wrong. I jerked into a sitting position and let my tired eyes adjust. Carter was gone. Shit, you idiot. What the hell? I said, standing and grabbing my clothes. I didn't take Carter as an adventurous person. Never mind a brave one. What was he thinking? If he was where I thought he was, then I needed to tell Ken immediately. I had been by the well. I knew the story held truth, and I knew there was something dangerous about it. I thought about waking Penny, but decided against it. I stomped into my boots and flung the door open. The night was calm, a fat white moon dripping its vanilla rays down to meet me. The camp was still, and sleep coated the air. I marched down the stairs and turned towards Ken's cabin when something caught my eye towards the tree line. Carter was walking towards me. He spotted me and gave me a sly smile.
Well, change your mind.
The big fire in the middle of the camp from earlier was almost out, but there was just enough flame that I could make out his features as he approached me. "What the hell are you doing?" I asked, my voice a harsh whisper.
Sorry, man.
He said, putting his hand in his pockets and shrugging.
I just had to see it for myself. It took me forever to find it.
I paused, cautious. You saw the well?" He nodded, the smile still on his face. I licked my lips. "And?" He slapped me on the shoulder.
Can's full of crap, I'm afraid. It's just a stupid well. There's nothing down there, man.
I released a breath I didn't know I had been holding in. "Wait, really? You actually went and looked down inside?" He chuckled and rubbed his eyes.
Yep. No ghosts or monsters, I'm afraid. Just Ken jerking us around. Well, it was a good story. I'll give him that.
I shook my head. Well, I guess I'm just a big baby then. Let's tell Penny in the morning. I think she was a little freaked out. He laughed.
All right. I'm totally busting on Ken too for trying to freak us out. Come on, let's go to bed.
As we turned back towards our cabin, the dying fire splashed the last of its light on Carter's face, and I noticed that his eyes were incredibly bloodshot. He rubbed them again, and we went back inside and slept till morning. The next day was blistering hot. As predicted, most of the guests wanted to take the paddle boats out onto the lake. Ken, back to his grandpa routine, helped the three of us make sure they were accommodated and happy. He asked if we would take shifts staying down by the water to keep an eye on things. Penny said she'd take the first shift, and so Carter and I stayed behind and saw to the daily chores. We had ended up not telling her. After a quick talk in our room that morning, we agreed that it was better if she didn't know because of her constant paranoia of getting in trouble, and if she was frightened by Ken's story, she didn't know it as she went about her morning. Carter was cheerful despite the heat and helped me prepare the wood for the evening's fire. His eyes were still terribly bloodshot, and when I asked him about it, he shrugged it off.
Probably called me a case of double pink eye. Yeah, just my luck. God, they itch like crazy. You think Ken has something for him? Eye drops, maybe.
He might. It looks bad, man, I said, dragging another log to the chopping block. He scrubbed at them.
Let's finish this first, shall we?
Today was cleaning day, and after we finished the wood, Carter went to relieve Penny. He ended up not speaking to Ken about his eyes, despite my protests. He said maybe a swim would clear them up, and I told him not to touch anyone if he was going to keep itching them. About a half hour after Carter left, Penny came strolling up the hill looking hot. She wiped sweat from her forehead.
You would never know I was in the water 10 minutes ago. It is stifling today, isn't it?
I nodded. Yeah, I'm looking forward to my shift at the lake. Did you see Carter?
Yeah. What's wrong with his eyes?
He thinks it's pink eye. She shivered.
Gross. Poor guy.
She scanned the campsite.
So, what do we have left? We're cleaning the cabins today, right? Midweek scrub for the guests?
I stretched my arms over my head. Yeah, sounds like fun, doesn't it? Ken told me this morning we don't have to go overboard. The deep clean is on Sunday in between arrivals. Just tidy up, make sure the bathrooms are clean, get rid of trash, all that.
All right, let's get to it then.
She said, and we both went to gather supplies for our afternoon of upkeep. Time went quickly with the two of us chatting and cleaning. The work quickly muted to the sound of good conversation and laughs. She was a nice girl, and I found myself growing slightly fond of her. We hadn't gotten much time to talk one-on-one, and I found her to be quite the pleasant person. As the sun crawled across the sky like a dying man in the desert, we finished up the last of the houses. I blinked sweat out of my eyes and let out a sigh as I saw Carter trudging up the hill. He saw us and waved, meeting us in the middle of the camp. His eyes were still bloodshot, but they looked much better than they had that morning.
Save any lives?
Penny asked with a smirk.
Any hot moms rescued?
Carter threw his head back and laughed.
Afraid not. No, just a bunch of whiny kids and drunk dads. You guys finished cleaning?
Yep, all that's left is to rake the grounds. I'm gonna go change and head down for a dip. To keep an eye on everyone. We all laughed and split ways. Carter and Penny going to retrieve the rakes, and myself down to the lake. The water was cold and wonderful. As the sun slowly dipped into a rainbow of colors, I spent the remainder of the day swimming and having casual conversation with the guests. I couldn't think of a more pleasant way to end the day. The story that night was about Ken's vision for the campground. He told the guests about all the improvements he wanted to make and how he wanted to redo the cabins. He involved the visitors, asking for their feedback and accepting their comments graciously. Most of the people had nothing but good things to say, all of them thanking the four of us for being such wonderful hosts and how they couldn't wait to come back next year and see the place. After the conversation dulled to a murmur and the moon rose high, everyone thanked us again and began to turn in for the night. After everyone was inside, Ken informed us that he was tired and he was going to turn in as well. We all wished him good night and went back to our cabin. Feeling exhausted myself from the heat and the day's activities, I told Ken and Penny I was going to bed. They both agreed with me and went to our rooms for the night. How's your eyes? I asked Carter, already in my bed with my eyes closed. He turned off the light next to my bed and crawled under his sheets.
Still itch like crazy. but I don't think they're as pink as they were this morning. Maybe tomorrow it'll be better.
I muttered my agreement and felt the day disappear into slumber. I awoke with my heart racing. I was bathed in a thick sheen of sweat and my throat was dry. Something wasn't right. My breath rattled past my cracked lips and into the dead air. I tried to sit up, but I crashed back down into my bed. Something was restraining me. What the hell? I wriggled around and found my wrists and ankles were tied to the bedpost. Confused and terrified, I fought with them for a few vain seconds before finally giving up. I raised my head to look over at Carter's bed. He wasn't in it. "Carter?" I said aloud. "Carter, where are you?" Silence, and then...
Shh.
The noise came from his side of the room, but I didn't see him. Heart still pounding. I stretched my fingers out to try to flick the lamp on next to my bed. My fingertips brushed the switch, and I pulled my head back as the ropes binding me cut into my skin. "Carter, what the hell's going on? Where are you?" I said, my voice cracking in panic. Silence. Then again.
Shh.
I didn't know if he was playing some kind of joke on me, and I didn't want to start screaming to wake up all the guests if that was the case, so I stretched my hand out again, fighting the pain that was burning into my wrist from the rope. Just a little bit. There. I turned the lamp on, and the yellow light pushed the shadows back. At first, I didn't see Carter, but movement caught my eye. He was laying under his bed, looking directly at me. He was smiling, and in horror, I saw that his eyes were nothing more than two bloody, pulpy orbs, rubbed so raw that he had cut into them with his fingernails and tore them out.
They won't stop itching,
he said to me, still smiling, and then he was up. Like lightning, he scurried out from under the bed and was on top of me. I struggled and was about to scream when he shoved a piece of cloth into my mouth hard. I gagged as his fingers pushed the torn sheet deeper, his thighs holding my body still with an iron clasp.
Just keep it down, buddy,
he said, his breath dry and smelling of bile. His bloody mush sockets stared down at me, and I turned my face away, the gore making me lightheaded. He sat up on me.
Is it gross? It is, isn't it? Here, let me do something about that.
He reached beside me and ripped apart the sheet I was sleeping under. He tied it around his eyes and the back of his head, the blood soaking through and appearing to give him two phantom red eyes.
There,
he said calmly.
That's better. I can see better like this anyway. I was hoping you wouldn't wake up, but I decided I needed to tie you up in case you decided to go looking for me again.
I whipped my head around and tried to buck him off me, terror and confusion slamming into me with every word he said. He held on and gripped my body tighter with his legs, pressing down on my chest with his hands.
Stop that,
he said firmly.
You're safe. I'm not gonna hurt you. I just need you to stay here, okay?
He lightly slapped my cheek.
Stay.
He was about to get off me when he paused, smiled to himself, and leaned back down towards me, whispering into my ear.
But there's something you should know. Do you want to know what it is? You do, don't you?
I bit down on the cloth in my mouth and nodded. He licked his lips.
I'm gonna cut Penny's fucking head off.
My eyes widened and I screamed into my gag, thrashing wildly. He chuckled softly and held me still, waiting patiently till I wore myself out. Panting hard around the cloth, I looked up at him, his smile full of teeth, the glistening red outlines of his mutilated eyes bleeding through the linen. The well. The thought crashed into my chaotic mind like a truck. It was the well. He had seen something down there. Somehow it had changed him. Suddenly, Carter raised his fists and brought them smashing down into my face, knocking me into darkness. I woke again, face swelling and painful. My vision swam, and the room was dark again. I was still gagged, and I could feel my breath becoming labored as my nose was clotted with blood. I was going to suffocate if I didn't get this rag out of my mouth. Slowly, in a daze, I worked my tongue and teeth over it until I could finally spit it out. Gasping in deep, grateful breaths, I struggled against the ropes that held me. After a few frustrating moments, I finally loosened them enough to get a hand free. A few more minutes of tearing, and I was completely out of my bindings. Penny. Oh no, Penny! I dashed to her room and kicked the door open. Empty. I felt my heart bubble into my chest, and I stood there trembling. Oh no, please, please, please! My eyes filled with tears, and I crashed out of the cabin. Ken, now! The night was thick, the air clawing at my skin with humidity. The moon stared down at me, uncaring and indifferent. The fire had gone out in the middle of the camp, and as I was about to charge Ken's cabin down at the end of the lot, I heard something screaming. It was Penny. I stood, frozen and immobile. It was coming from the woods. I knew where she had been taken. Biting my lip, my face screwed up in mental agony, I looked at Ken's cabin and then bolted towards the woods, towards the well. She might have seconds to live. If she was still alive, I needed to get to her and stop Carter. Please, God, let her still be okay. Please, please, God. I crashed down the path, bare feet scraping against the stones and branches, my toes slamming into rock and wood. I didn't care. I didn't think about it. I flew as fast as my legs would take me, heart beating faster with every step. There, I reached the curve in the path and turned left into the woods. Crashing through the underbrush, I held my hands out in front of me, pushing aside the low-hanging branches and leaves that reached toward my face. Panting, I broke into the clearing and froze. Carter had Penny bent over the opening of the well. He was standing behind her, with his fist gripping her hair, pulling her head back to expose her throat. The muscles in his arms strained as he worked a knife into her pale flesh, slowly slicing into her back and forth, deeper and deeper. He paused and looked up, seeing me.
Oh, hey.
Penny! I screamed in the moonlight. Her eyes slowly rolled over to meet mine. Agony. Jesus fucking Christ! Penny, hang on! I screamed, tears rolling down my face. Carter ignored my outburst, taking the time to wipe sweat from his face and tightening the cloth around his eyes.
You know, this is a lot harder than you'd think.
Carter, stop! It's Penny! You're killing her! I screamed. He stared at me silently, the blood-stained sheet around his eyes looking black. Finally, he motioned at me with his bloody knife, one hand still gripping Penny's hair.
Come stop me then.
I swallowed and was about to charge him when I realized I couldn't. My knees had turned to water and all the strength in my body had drained. The force seemed to press in on me. My breath came out in little gasps and I was terrified. I felt my bladder release and warmth spread down my legs. The well, the fucking well. I couldn't even look at it. I was filled with such nightmares that I wanted nothing more than to turn and run, get out of here, get out of these mountains, and get as far away from that well as I could. Carter was smiling.
You can't, can you? You're terrified.
He tapped the top of the well with his knife.
Come on. Come over here. Look down there.
His smile grew.
Look down in the well.
Please, I mumbled, vision blurring with tears and snot bubbling out of my nose. Please, stop this! Carter shook his head slowly.
No. In fact, I think it's time to finish this.
He raised his knife again and brought it back to Penny's throat. She was slumped over now, but just as he was about to resume cutting, her eyes met mine and she muttered a single word.
Run.
Hearing her speak, I ripped myself from my terror, face streaking with tears and mucus. I charged Carter. Every step towards him, my body seemed to increase in weight, pulling me to the earth. I gripped my teeth and steeled my adrenaline, crashing into Carter just as he was turning towards me, mouth agape in surprise. He slammed into the side of the wall hard, knocking the knife out of his hand. We both went down, and I hit my head against the stone, stunning me. The world spun, and I heard him growling, already beginning to stand.
You don't know what you're doing, you fucking idiot.
He snarled, grabbing me by the hair and slamming my face into the ground. I bit my tongue and howled in pain, feeling blood fill my mouth. Dizzy, I rolled onto my back and stared up at him. He stepped on my chest and leaned down, his voice raw.
You can't stop this.
He quickly jumped back and grabbed Penny, pulling her up and across his shoulders. He hoisted them up onto the lip of the well, and silently, they tumbled down into the darkness. They were gone. No! I screamed, my voice splintering. I scrambled up, sobbing, pleading, and gripping the side of the well. I looked down into the blackness. I looked down into the well. My eyes went wide, and the world stopped. Oh no, I whispered. I need to get this information off my chest. I'm recording this on the shoulder of the highway in Utah. It's 4 a.m., and I've been driving non-stop for almost 2 hours. I don't know if you've ever been to Utah, but it gets pitch black at night. Nothing exists beyond the high beams of my car. Well, at least from what I can perceive. I know something is out there, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I was backpacking through Zion National Park, this fantastic place where the canyon walls are deep sunset red, and pine trees grow straight out of the rocks. Even in my delirium, I can still appreciate the beauty of it. My trip wasn't anything serious, just a 3-day turnaround trip spanning about 30 miles in total. I don't see that many people around this time of year, aside from the occasional day hiker. Most tend to stay out during the winter due to the cold weather, snow, and the risk of flash floods brought on from the rainy season. However, I thrive in isolation. The fewer people around make it easier for me to appreciate the park and all its natural beauty. For the uninitiated, backpacking is a challenging activity that most people don't dare to try, which is unfortunate. I feel like people come the most alive when they push themselves to do these kinds of things, and as cheesy as it sounds, you really do experience some magic when you're this far removed from the city and our modern luxuries. I could go on about the ecosystems that have never encountered human contact and how it feels to step into a truly wild world, but I'd be talking out of my ass. Because after today, I realized I genuinely have no idea of what lives in those woods, or any area not lived in by people. It was my second night after 2 long days of walking in a straight line and slowly pacing myself and exploring. I set up my tent and got ready to hurry back to my car. As much as I love the outdoors, nothing can compete with the sensation of hot fast food after several days of roughing it. As I ate my military rations, I was already imagining the cheeseburgers I'd be eating the following day. Over the last 2 days, I walked about 15 miles into the park, covering about 7 miles a day with my heavy bag. I'll be the first to tell you how important it is not to overpack for trips like these. Every pound makes a difference when you're carrying it through the brush. Even short excursions can be challenging if your bag is too heavy. Fortunately, I learned from my previous trips and kept my pack to around 35 pounds. After my meal of powdered lasagna and a candy bar was finished, I poked at the hot coals in my makeshift fire pit. I also packed a camp stove to cook with, but when you go camping, you have to make a campfire. It's an unofficial rule that everyone follows. There's something about being in the wilderness at night that triggers a subconscious instinct in us to build a fire and illuminate the dark. Our ancestors used this instinct daily to survive, and it became embedded in our DNA. Tonight, this instinct kept me alive. As my fire began to shrink, my desire for sleep began to increase. When you're in the woods with no technology, the oppressive darkness brought on by night naturally makes you drowsy. I was getting ready to stand up and put out my fire when I suddenly noticed the sensation that I was being watched. That feeling washed over me, and after identifying it, I realized there were no sounds in the woods around me. Even in winter, you can hear noises from the non-hibernating critters, but all I could hear was the wind rustling through the trees above me, and see the gaps between the branches barely illuminated by the light of a crescent moon. At the time, it felt like a better idea to build my fire back up. I could always put it out later, after all, and this was my last night in the woods, so I could spare using extra materials. As I put my remaining wood in the fire, I thought I heard something in the tree line. I had set up my tent in a small clearing, no larger than 15 feet. It was just big enough for me to put my tent in the center and have about 10 feet on all sides. So whatever I was hearing was incredibly close to me, and even with my medium-sized campfire, I couldn't see anything outside of the clearing. A couple of times I heard rustling in the leaves, and I shined my spotlight in the direction of the noise, but all I would ever see were the same piles of dead leaves that covered the forest floor everywhere else in the winter. I didn't smell blood or rot or anything you usually read about in ghost stories. I genuinely had no idea at all what was moving around my camp, and I think that was more unnerving. I just know that something was circling my shelter, but wouldn't walk into the clearing. This isn't entirely unexpected. After all, Zion is home to many different species of animals, including coyotes, foxes, and mountain lions. My worst fear at this moment would be to have a cougar in my camp, and not the fun kind in this case. I sat back in front of the fire after patrolling my site's perimeter and found a red flower right in front of where I sat before. Now, I know this may seem insignificant to the uninitiated, but finding a flower like this in the middle of January was entirely out of place. And stranger still, I had no memory of seeing this flower from the previous 3 hours of sitting by the fire. I studied it closely, noting that it was indeed rooted to the earth. It hadn't been placed on the ground. It must have already been there, and I just didn't notice. I picked it up and realized I didn't recognize the species. I'm no expert on the flora and fauna of Zion, but I haven't seen a plant like this anywhere before. I washed out the bag my MRE came in and placed the flower inside to take home and look up on the internet. I was sure someone on Reddit would be able to identify it. With no other oddities, I eventually gave in to my exhaustion and went to sleep. I know you're not supposed to, but I let my fire burn out on its own. It was low enough I didn't think it would be a hazard, but the soft glow gave me a feeling of security to sleep. I must have been asleep for about an hour before I woke up to the feeling of something large moving under my tent. The best way I can describe it is to imagine if a large snake slithered under your sheets in bed as you laid down on top of it. It was so unnatural I shot awake immediately, and still trapped in my sleeping bag, fell over in the process of my escape. Turning on my light and aiming it at the floor revealed that something was moving under the thin material of my tent's floor, inspecting the warm spot where I was sleeping. My mind was racing as I began to theorize what it could possibly be. Maybe it was a skunk that was getting too nosy for its own good, or maybe it really was a snake, but I couldn't think of a species of snake in Utah that could be thicker than my arm. Also, again, snakes aren't usually active in the middle of winter, especially in the dark of night. My fear of the unknown propelled me out of my tent with just enough clarity for me to grab my bag and step into the clearing. I can't begin to describe the feeling of confusion and dread that overcame me when I saw a ring of those damn red flowers completely circled around my tent. They were all planted in the ground the same as the first, but forming a perfect circle that nature could not produce so accurately by itself. Without any warning, I heard the sound of fabric tearing apart, followed by the sounds of something desperately clawing at my tent, and what I can only describe as a low, bassy groaning. It didn't sound natural. It sounded more like a low frequency you'd hear if you turned the bass in your car all the way up and amplified that several times. It was more than just a sound. It reverberated in my insides and made me feel nauseous. Then, illuminated by my spotlight, a massive arm shot out from the top of my tent, an inhuman appendage with odd-numbered digits and skin that more resembled tree bark than flesh. The demon limb pulled my entire tent under the earth in one swift move, leaving behind a crumbled mess of dirt, but leaving the flowers undisturbed. I was shocked. I couldn't move. Hell, I couldn't even process what happened. Nothing in my wildest dreams could prepare me for what I could only describe as a shark pulling my shelter under the compact soil like it was water. I stood there for what felt like hours, but in reality was only a few moments. I felt that frequency again from below the earth. It sounded frustrated, like it didn't get what it was after. I finally found my courage and ran from that spot. I lost some supplies that I left inside my tent and around my campsite, but I couldn't care less at the moment. I just ran through the brush with my light trembling in my hand. I was constantly bumping into trees and grazing my legs on the thorny bushes, but the only thing on my mind was survival. Fight or flight is another instinct we inherit from our ancestors, the primal knowledge when we know we're up against something out of our league. I continued to hear the shifting of leaves behind me, but no matter where I shined my light, I saw nothing chasing me. I would gladly take a cougar at this point. At least I could have identified the threat and could know how to handle it. Then, at the last moment, I caught a glimpse of another one of those damn red flowers right in the middle of my path. I barely noticed it before I stepped on it by accident. As I said, it was right smack dab in my path, almost deliberately placed. The second my foot came into contact with it, I felt the earth shift under my weight. I lost my balance and fell face first onto the ground. I broke my nose in the process, but I didn't get the chance to appreciate the pain before that same arm wrapped its fingers around my boot. I don't think fingers is an accurate description. They were more like roots from a tree, long and gnarled and extending across my foot and up my leg. I quickly pulled my foot out of my boot and propelled myself away from the crater. The arm whipped back into the ground, taking its prized boot under the dirt with it. Despite the discomfort of only wearing one boot, I continued to run, bloodying my unprotected foot but not caring about the pain. Survival was the only thing on my mind. I started throwing things out of my pack to make travel a little easier. I had dropped about 10 pounds of gear when I found the bag with the red flower in it. I remembered how the thing attacked me when I stepped on the red flower. Was this thing tracking me because I took the flower? My curiosity wasn't worth being pulled beneath the earth. I took the flower out of the bag and threw it behind me in the direction of the noise of churning dirt. Before it even hit the ground, the same arm shot out of the dirt and caught it. To my surprise, it caught the flower with a tender open palm, not crushing the flower. A second arm emerged from the dirt, followed then by a third and a fourth, until there were more arms than I could count in the darkness. Then what I perceived to be the creature's head rose from the center. I say perceived because it didn't have a face or anything I would recognize as a face, but it was in the center of its bulky mass, and the hand with the flower was raised in front of it. In complete contrast to its behavior up until now, it delicately nurtured the flower, applying some kind of ointment to the bottom of the stem where I had cut it out, and planting it in the ground, its low frequency now resembling the cooing of a mourning dove, still as deep as before, but anger replaced by something else. At this point, I began to back away from this creature. I stepped on a dead tree branch, and it snapped its head in my direction, but quickly turned back to its precious flower. I ran for hours until I reached my car. I'd never been so relieved to find my beat-up pickup truck. As I pulled out of the woods and onto the main park road, I noticed a couple of red flowers along the side of the road. I made note to steer clear of them. I know now what happens if you mess with this creature's prized flowers. Looking at the clock, it was 2 a.m. The sun must have set around 5 p.m. the day before. I had covered 15 miles on foot in that time, and I was still on edge. The ranger station was closed for the night. The lights of the building turned off as I sped by. I stopped my car because my engine was running hot after pushing it so hard for the last couple of hours. I'm taking a break from camping for now. I love the outdoors, but seriously need to reconsider what threats live just out of sight of man. I'm not entirely sure what I saw tonight, but if you go camping, do not take anything that doesn't belong to you, and always listen to your instincts. Mine kept me alive today. We have them for a reason. I vividly remember the day Duke disappeared. My family was spending the day at the lake next to our little bungalow at a quaint property in northern Ontario. All four of us were swimming and splashing around in the warm lake water, attempting to quell the blistering August heat. Our only neighbor for miles, an old retired police officer named Benny, was smoking on his patio. I waved to him, and he waved back. We were in the dog days of summer, and I was just glad to be in the water. Duke loved the water as much as I did, and was still very energetic, being a large, middle-aged mutt. We would often throw frisbees and sticks off the dock, where he would take flying leaps into the blue-green lake. That's exactly what we were doing when he vanished. As I was drawing back my hand to throw the frisbee for Duke, who was anticipating a throw and getting ready to run, he suddenly whipped his head to the woods. I too looked back at the rows of towering hardwoods and conifers, scanning them to see what Duke was looking at. It was nothing, at least to me. What followed was a blur. Duke suddenly bolted for the trees, barking and snarling, all while we were screaming his name. I screamed at my parents to get out of the water and help me chase him. I even saw Benny spring out of his rocking chair to help us. I ran as fast as my 9-year-old legs could carry me into the dense forest, twigs and debris snapping under my feet. But you can only get so far in flip-flops before you trip. I tumbled to the ground, screaming and crying after accidentally scraping my leg against a sharp rock. My mom consoled me while I caught a glimpse of my dad running through the woods. It was a while before my dad and Benny came back. My dad had a somber look on his face. He didn't have to tell us what we already knew, but Benny looked shaken. I'm sorry, folks, but he ain't coming back, he said shakily. He took off his faded baseball cap respectively and patted me on the shoulder before trudging up the hill back to his house. My whole family missed him, but to me it felt like a part of me left when Duke did. He had been my best friend since I was 9, and I even had a small photo album packed with pictures of the two of us. For a while, every night before bed, I would sift through the laminated pages of the photo album, reminiscing about good times and praying that someday he would come back to us. Deep down, I knew he wouldn't. A few months after Duke disappeared, my dad arrived home from work with a surprise. It was another dog. It wasn't elegant and athletic like Duke was. It was one of those tiny, white, yappy ones with crusty red goop around its eyes. My parents fell in love with it. Princess, they called her, but I didn't. I simply referred to her as the dog. I was bitter. So bitter because I'd interpreted my dad's gesture of kindness as his own confirmation of Duke's absence. In time, I did grow to tolerate her. I had to admit she was good company, and it was cute when she curled up by my feet. Life was going normally for us until Duke came back. It had almost been a year since Duke had disappeared. On this particular day, we were all cooped up inside, courtesy of the rain. I was engulfed in my book when suddenly I heard a bark. Not a high-pitched yap, but a deep, booming bark. I put down my book and rushed to the back door where I had heard it, Princess scuttling at my heels. When I peeked through the window, I nearly fell over. It was Duke, somehow. By this time, my parents had arrived. My mom rushed past me and whirled the door open, while my dad and I hung back, mouths agape. As my mom hugged Duke, I couldn't help but notice something off. I'd spent countless hours spending time with him and sleepless nights poring over photo albums. I'd familiarized myself with every spot, marking, and quirk of Duke's fur. One of his most striking features was a black spot over his left eye, which had appeared in almost every one of the photos. But standing here was Duke. His eye spot was now on his right eye. As a matter of fact, his whole pelt seemed to have been flipped. He was missing his collar, and he was skinnier than when we'd last seen him, but it was him all right. Well, that's what I'd thought. The first red flag was how Princess reacted to Duke. She was a yappy dog all right, but when she saw Duke, she went ballistic, spitting and yapping like we'd never seen before. Princess barks at everything, remember? My dad told me, sensing my discomfort. She's probably just barking because she smells like the forest. And with that, he went outside to greet Duke. The barking must have alerted Benny, and he went outside to see what the commotion was. Once he saw what was going on, he darted back into his house and audibly slammed the door. When my parents came back inside, I tentatively stuck out a hand for Duke to sniff. He didn't wag his tail like I expected him to. All he did was quietly sit down. Then he heard Princess yapping from the other side of the room. His head swiveled and he lifted himself and padded confidently towards her. Before long, he had her cornered. All he was doing was standing and watching her, yet Princess's eyes were bulging as she howled and yapped. A sense of dread was beginning to creep up my spine, but before anything happened, my dad whistled and Duke lifted his head. With one last glance at Princess, he slunk away. The sense of wrongness didn't alleviate for the rest of the time Duke was with us. The second red flag was that Duke didn't eat the food we put out for him. Granted, it was food intended for small dogs, but it was still the same formula. Dogs are wired to eat everything they can get their paws on anyway, so even then it wouldn't have mattered. Not once did I see him eat. Every time we let him outside in the woods to relieve himself, he came back 20 minutes later, his white muzzle stained pink. I found it odd that my parents didn't think he was at risk of running away again, but since he didn't run, I never brought it up. They spent all their time with Duke, petting him, coddling him, attempting to feed him, and playing with him. All this while completely ignoring Princess, as well as my objections. Something's different about him, I brought up during dinner one night. That's nonsense. What are you talking about? Said my dad. He's a good old Duke. He looked at the dog as if searching for approval. We ate the rest of dinner in silence. As the summer went on, Duke seemed to gain more and more influence over my family. At this point, it was just me taking care of Princess. It was up to me to feed, walk, and take care of her now, as my parents had completely neglected her. This dog wasn't the Duke I used to know. Every time he walked into the same room that Princess was in, she would scuttle away in fear and into my arms. I took to always being in the same room as Princess, just as a precaution. From what, I didn't want to admit, but deep down, I think I knew. One day, Benny approached me while I was walking Princess. Are you doing okay, kid? Yeah, it's... I trailed off. Benny bent down to meet my height. His friendly blue eyes clouded with concern. Be careful, kid. If you need any help, I'm right up here. Without another word, he turned and walked back into his house.